I want you to picture this. A man in a $400 tie, standing at the head of a conference table, telling 40 of his own employees that the woman who built the department they were about to gut had never actually done any real work. He said that on a Tuesday. By Friday, he didn't have an office anymore. This is the story of how Rachel Bennett got her name back, and how one folder, 3 years in the making, ended a career built entirely on someone else's spreadsheets. Rachel Bennett was 34 years old, and for 6 of those years she had worked at Halcyon Logistics, a mid-sized freight and supply chain company out of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place that never makes the news, which is exactly why it's the kind of place things like this can happen. She started as a financial analyst, good with numbers, better with patterns, the kind of person who could look at a spreadsheet full of shipping delays and freight costs and see, before anyone else did, that something was quietly bleeding the company dry. By year 3, she wasn't just finding the leaks, she was the one building the systems that stopped them. A routing optimization model that saved the West Coast division $400,000 in its first year. A vendor renegotiation framework that became company-wide policy. Reports that went all the way up to the board, with her name at the bottom of every one of them. And that was the problem. Because in year 4, Halcyon hired a new VP of operations, a man named Todd Whitfield. Todd was 51, came from a competitor twice Halcyon's size, and had the kind of resume that photographed well but didn't hold up under close reading. He talked in the language of synergy and verticals. He was charming in meetings and cold in one-on-ones. And within his first month, he had identified the one thing in the department more valuable than any process he could bring in himself. Rachel? Specifically, Rachel's work. It started small. Todd would ask her to walk him through a report before a leadership meeting, just so I have context, and then present her findings in that meeting as his own strategic insight. Rachel would sit 2 seats down the table and watch the board nod along to her own analysis, credited to a man who, as far as she could tell, hadn't opened Excel in a decade. She told herself it didn't matter. The work was getting done. The company was improving. That was the point, right? But it kept happening. Every quarter. Every major win. Todd's name climbing the internal newsletter. Rachel's name disappearing from the credits line by line, until eventually project summaries just said Operations Leadership instead of her name at all. She raised it once, gently in a one-on-one. She said she'd like to start presenting her own findings directly to leadership going forward. Todd smiled, told her that visibility isn't the same as value and that the best players don't need the spotlight to know they're good. Then he told her he'd note her interest for her next review. Her next review came 6 months later. She got a 2% raise, half the cost of living adjustment that year, and a line in the write-up that said her communication and executive presence needed development. The same skill Todd was using her material to fake, in front of the same executives every single week. Here's the thing about people like Todd Whitfield. They don't just take credit. Taking credit is a symptom. The disease underneath it is that they believe the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to them. And Rachel started to notice things that had nothing to do with her byline. It started with a vendor contract, a trucking partner in Nevada that Halcyon had used for 11 years, reliable, well-priced, nothing remarkable about them except that they worked. Then, 3 months into Todd's tenure, the company switched to a new logistics partner, one that Todd had, as he put it in the announcement, email, personally vetted through his extensive industry network. The new contract cost 18% more per shipment. Rachel ran the numbers because running the numbers was her job. She quietly flagged the discrepancy to her direct manager, not to Todd, framing it as a routine cost variance she'd noticed while reconciling quarterly freight spend. Nothing happened. The flag disappeared into the same silence that had swallowed her byline, so she kept a folder. Not to go to war, not yet, just to remember. Rachel had learned the hard way that memory is the first thing a workplace like this tries to take from you. They rewrite the story in real time, and if you don't have your own record, eventually you start doubting whether you remember it right at all. The folder started as a simple thing, screenshots of emails where she'd submitted a report, time-stamped, followed by screenshots of the leadership meeting summary where Todd presented the same findings as original thinking. Nothing dramatic, just dates, facts, a timeline. Then the vendor situation kept nagging at her, and the folder grew a second section. She found the new vendor's registration paperwork through a public state filing search, the kind any analyst worth her salary knows how to pull. The logistics company Todd had personally vetted had been incorporated 4 months before Halcyon signed with them. The registered agent's address matched an apartment complex 40 minutes from Todd's house. Rachel didn't jump to conclusions. She was too good at her job for that. Correlation wasn't proof, and she knew it. But she also knew that 18% overspend times the volume Halcyon shipped times 12 months was not a rounding error. It was millions of dollars a year moving from Halcyon's accounts to a company that hadn't existed until Todd walked in the door. She kept building the folder. For a while, that would have been the end of it. A quiet folder, a private grievance, a woman doing her job well while someone else got the applause. A lot of people live their whole careers in exactly that arrangement and never do anything about it, because doing something about it is terrifying. It puts a target on your back in a building where the person with power over your paycheck is the person you'd be accusing. But then Todd made a mistake. He got greedy in a way that stopped being about Rachel's ego and started being about her job security. Halcyon announced a restructuring. Cost-cutting, they called it. A word that always means someone is about to lose their income so someone else can keep their bonus. Todd was asked to identify redundancies in operations. He put Rachel's role on the list. The justification, when it filtered down to her through her manager, almost impressed her with its audacity. Her position had limited strategic impact relative to cost, and her responsibilities could be absorbed into existing leadership bandwidth. Existing leadership bandwidth? Todd was going to keep doing her job, the job he'd been quietly stealing for 2 years, and lay her off for not contributing enough. That night, Rachel didn't cry. She'd expected to, if this day ever came. But instead she felt something colder and more useful settle into place. Not rage, clarity. She opened her folder. 2 years of screenshots, timestamps, and a vendor paper trail that had been sitting quietly, waiting for a reason to matter. She realized she had a choice to make. She could take this to HR quietly, the way she'd tried before, and watch it disappear into the same silence. Or she could make it impossible to ignore. She chose the second option. But she chose it the smart way. Not with anger, but with a plan. Rachel had one advantage Todd didn't know about. She understood exactly how a company like Halcyon actually made decisions, because she was the one who'd spent 6 years building the systems that surfaced information to leadership. She knew who Ryu had what. She knew which numbers made a CFO's blood pressure spike. She knew that a vague complaint about credit stealing would get filed as a personality conflict, but a documented pattern of financial irregularity would get a lawyer's attention within the hour. So she stopped thinking about herself as a wronged employee and started thinking about herself as an analyst building a report, because that's what she was good at. That's the one thing Todd had never actually been able to fake. Over the next 3 weeks, while her layoff notice sat unsigned on HR's desk pending final restructuring approval, Rachel built the most thorough piece of analysis of her career. She laid out the vendor timeline, incorporation date, registered agent address, the 18% cost increase projected annually across the full freight volume, $2.1 million a year in excess spend, 3 years running, over $6 million conservatively. She laid out the credit pattern separately, not as an accusation but as a factual record. Report submitted, date, timestamp, presentation given, date, timestamp, identical findings, different name attached. 11 instances, side by side, undeniable once you saw them stacked in a single column. And she prepared one more thing, a resignation letter. Not because she planned to use it, but because a person negotiating from a position of fear makes different decisions than a person who has already made peace with walking away. Rachel wanted to walk into whatever came next as someone who had nothing left to lose, because that is the version of yourself that actually wins. She requested a meeting, not with HR, not with Todd, but with the CFO directly, a woman named Diane Ferris who Rachel had worked with closely on budget reconciliation for years. Diane was not someone who tolerated waste, and she was not someone who owed Todd Whitfield anything. Rachel didn't send the whole file ahead of time. She sent one line, "I have information relevant to operations vendor spend and the current restructuring decisions. I think you'll want to see this before anything is finalized." 15 minutes. Diane replied in 11 minutes. "My office, tomorrow 9 a.m. Rachel walked in at 8:58, laid the folder on the table, and said almost nothing. She let the documents do the talking, the way she always had, except this time she made sure her name was the only one attached to the analysis. Diane went quiet for a long time reading through the vendor timeline. When she got to the part about the registered agent's address matching an apartment complex near Todd's house, she looked up and asked one question. "Is this verified?" "Public record," Rachel said. "Every document is a state filing or a company email. Nothing here is speculation." Diane closed the folder. "And the restructuring list?" "I'm on it," Rachel said. "For, and I quote, limited strategic impact." Something in Diane's face shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like a piece finally clicking into a puzzle she hadn't realized she was looking at. "Give me 48 hours, she said. "Don't sign anything. Don't say anything to anyone. Can you do that?" Rachel said she could. What happened over the next 48 hours Rachel only pieced together later from people who were in the room and people who weren't supposed to talk about it but did anyway because offices always talk. Diane brought the folder to legal that same afternoon. Legal brought in an outside forensic accountant by the next morning. By early afternoon, someone had pulled Todd's expense reports, his calendar entries around the vendor switch, and a set of internal messages that, once someone was actually looking, painted a picture that took about 4 hours to become undeniable. The vendor wasn't just overpriced. It was a shell arrangement, a company that existed almost entirely on paper, run by an old colleague of Todd's, kicking a percentage of every inflated invoice back to an account that eventually, through 2 more shell layers, traced to Todd himself. It wasn't subtle once someone competent looked for it. It had just never occurred to anyone to look, because nobody imagined the VP of operations would risk a 6-figure salary for a scheme that greedy. That was the whole trick. Confidence is the best disguise there is, right up until someone stops being intimidated by it. Friday morning, Halcyon called an all-hands meeting. The same conference room where, 3 weeks earlier, Todd had stood at the head of the table and told 40 employees that certain unnamed contributors had limited strategic impact. This time, it was Diane at the head of the table. Todd was seated, not standing, 3 chairs down, flanked by someone from legal and someone from HR. The universal seating chart of a man about to lose his job. Diane kept it short. She announced that, effective immediately, the company was terminating its contract with the new logistics vendor following the discovery of financial irregularities. She announced that Todd Whitfield was no longer with the company. She did not go into detail. Legal advised against it, and there would be a much longer conversation happening in a courtroom eventually. But she said one more thing before she opened the floor. I also want to acknowledge that the analysis which uncovered this issue and which has quietly driven most of this department's actual performance gains over the last 2 years came from Rachel Bennett. Going forward, the restructuring list is being revised, and Rachel will be moving into a newly created Director of Operations Analytics role, reporting directly to me. Nobody clapped. Exactly. Corporate rooms rarely do. Everyone too aware of the man sitting 3 chairs down with his jaw set and his eyes on the table. But there was a shift in the room. 40 people who had spent 2 years applauding the wrong name finally understood who had actually been keeping the lights on. Rachel didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just nodded once, the same way she always had when a report she'd built landed the way it was supposed to. Todd Whitfield was walked out of the building that same afternoon by building security, carrying a single box, past the cubicles he used to stride through like he owned them. He was charged 8 months later with fraud and embezzlement following a joint investigation between Halcyon's legal team and state prosecutors. The shell vendor scheme, once fully unwound, had cost the company just under $7 million over 3 years. He took a plea deal, restitution, probation, and an unemployable name in an industry that talks. Rachel Bennett took the director role. 6 months later, she stood in that same conference room, this time at the head of the table, presenting a quarterly report under her own name to a room that had learned, the hard way, exactly whose work they'd been watching all along. She never went looking for revenge. She didn't sabotage him, didn't leak rumors, didn't play any game beneath the one she was already good at. She just did what she had always done. She paid attention, she kept the receipts, and she let the truth do the only thing the truth has ever needed to do. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be true, and it needs someone patient enough to make sure it eventually gets seen. If you've ever done the work and watched someone else take the bow for it, remember this. The people who need to steal credit are always hiding something bigger underneath it. Keep your folder, keep your receipts. Your time is coming.